I'm here with John Ramdeen. Ramdeen, I cannot recall a series of events in succession like this, maybe ever, in mixed martial arts. This level of stories, just so many different discussions. What came out of UFC 199, the unfortunate passing of Kimbo Slice. We have a rematch involving Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor that we're talking about for the first time here on a Wednesday.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why is just the return of Brock Lesnar. You talked about the passing of Kimbo Slice, two very important things because, you know, we're talking about two of the biggest stars maybe ever in the history of mixed martial arts. The drawing power of both Kimbo Slice and Brock Lesnar, and especially Brock Lesnar and everything surrounding the whole Brock Lesnar news with the Ariel Helwani situation. So I think, you know, as much as the UFC is upset with Ariel Helwani for breaking the news, it's almost as if it's a bigger story now that he was booted out of the UFC 199 and now he's allowed back in. I think the story of Brock Lesnar's return to mixed martial arts, to the UFC, is even bigger than it would have been had it just been an announcement made by the UFC at UFC 199.
Well, I think they did the right thing in announcing the reinstatement of MMA fighting and Ariel Helwani, because as much as we can say that this was triggered by the Brock Lesnar story, Sunday and Monday, people were not really discussing the Brock Lesnar fight. The Ariel Helwani story overshadowed, to me, the Brock Lesnar story. And that's even with the announcement that he was fighting Mark Hunt. I think the fact that they have rectified that situation, now people are focusing on here. But it's also, you hear a lot of mainstream outlets now that are talking about the Josh Grosses of the world and the practices of the UFC. I don't know that the UFC can look back on these last number of days and be happy with the way that they were portrayed here, and I think deserved all of this criticism that came their way.
I understand exactly what you're saying. It shouldn't be the UFC that gets to dictate what news is out there. If a reporter or a journalist, they get a hold of a story, it's their job, it's their responsibility to break it. I understand the UFC had this announcement, but we've seen that in the past. You know, as soon as the UFC doesn't agree with a reporter, whether it be Loretta Hunt, Ariel Helwani, or Josh Gross, they remove them. They don't allow them to cover their events. It's an unfortunate part of the game, but the UFC's kind of been able to play by their own rules ever since Zuffa purchased the company. So I'm not surprised. However, you know, after the cooler heads did prevail and Ariel Helwani, many people recognize him as the best journalist in the business. He gets to cover the events.
Speaking about Brock Lesnar, there was an interesting sidebar to all of this, and that is that Brock Lesnar is coming back in the USADA era of the UFC, which was not a part of the UFC when he left at the end of 2011. And the way the policy is stated by USADA is that if a retired fighter comes back, they have to have a written notice that they are returning, and then they're subjected to 4 months of drug testing. And the thought process behind that is so a fighter doesn't just retire, can get on stuff, and then suddenly comes back. The UFC, it also states in that policy, for extraordinary circumstances, the UFC can make exemptions. And that's what they are choosing to do here with Brock Lesnar, stating that he left long before this USADA policy was in place. The bout agreement was signed on Friday, and he won't be subjected to 4 months of testing because obviously UFC 200 is a month away.
Yeah, it seems like a dangerous precedent, though. My question is, when did these talks with Brock Lesnar, when did they first start happening? Did they happen when it looked like Conor McGregor and Nathan Diaz? That fight was not going to happen at UFC 200. Were these talks happening way before that? Has Brock Lesnar been training for the last...
Brock Ballpark did it 3 months ago when he was on ESPN.
So 3 months ago, is that a real date? Is that a real number? We're not sure. But I think a dangerous precedent is being set here because the UFC can say, okay, well, we want to do it for this scenario or this scenario. So I just think that, Brock Lesnar is going to come under criticism because I think when we talk about the smell test, when it comes to USADA, Brock Lesnar would be at the top of that list. The fact is, he's going to be tested a boatload of times between today's date and UFC 200.
And that's kind of lost in this. I think some people are taking the story to mean he's walking in without any testing. Yeah. He's not getting the 4-month treatment, and I don't feel great about that they are not going by this policy because this is a big star coming back. He is going to be tested going into 200.
Yeah, that's true. They're going to be, I'm sure they're going to be camped up somewhere in Saskatchewan ready to just show up at Brock Lesnar's door at a moment's notice. And And again, I think that the UFC wants that, because you bring in this guy, people are going to be pointing the fingers at him, and at the end of the day, he'll get to say, actually, I was tested way more than any other fighter. So going into UFC 200, I think everybody will be fine.
Okay, I would love to see some cameras as he gets that 6 a.m. knock on his door out of civilization. Now, we mentioned it, Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor. This fight, there is no denying, this announcement, an afterthought after everything that has happened over the last number of days. This was announced prior to the UFC 200 announcement of Brock Lesnar, about a half hour before at UFC 199. This is a massive fight for August the 20th, and it's going to feature two guys that this fight, to me, significantly bigger than the first time they announced a rematch for UFC 200. It was met with some lukewarm reaction of people who maybe didn't want to see the rematch immediately, but when it was taken away and all of the drama that ensued publicly, this thing has grown into a gigantic animal, and you can count on UFC 202 being a massive amount of business the UFC is going to generate.
Yeah, UFC 200 and UFC 202. With the whole Brock Lesnar situation, it's kind of taken the heat away from Nathan Diaz and Conor McGregor, the Ariel Helwani story as well, and Kimbo Slice and Muhammad Ali. So people expect, well, is this fight going to be as big as the first fight? It's going to be bigger than the first. It's 100% going to be bigger, because right now we're focused on UFC 200. Come the end of July and UFC 200, because there'll be so many promo videos talking about this rematch between Nathan Diaz and Conor McGregor that by the time we get to August, the entire world is going to need to see this fight, because Conor's going to have the things that he has to say about why he didn't participate at UFC 200, because he understands the challenge that lays ahead of him and Nathan Diaz, and he wants to be the best version, the best 170-pound version of Conor McGregor. So I think that fight fans are going to get exactly what they need leading into that fight in August.
So as we look at this unique deal involving the UFC and the WWE, which had to be organized and negotiated for Brock Lesnar to fight at UFC 200.
And both parties have to be satisfied.
Yes, and it's curious because this fight, there was zero mention of this on the WWE's programming this week, which this was a week where it was a massive news story and it was absent from the WWE's broadcast. However, the natural question is, what is the WWE getting for this? There are contracts for a reason so that things like this do not happen. So first, it was reported by PWInsider.com that there's interest in using Paige Van Zandt coming off of Dancing with the Stars to work the SummerSlam date, which would be 24 hours after UFC 202, which, to throw in a further sidebar to this, Jeremy Botter reporting that is when they are targeting CM Punk's debut. So there's this weird marriage, if we can call it that, John, between the WWE and UFC, two sides that have been pretty distinct from one another, that are somewhat getting in bed with each other, even if it's reluctantly.
Yeah, and you say reluctantly, it's because combat sports is incestuous. You know, we've had so many crossover stars. Floyd Mayweather's been a part of the WWE. Mike Tyson has been a part of it as well. You've had Goldberg, mixed martial arts. So you see how the different pieces of the puzzle fit into the different areas of combat sports, and it's trying to capitalize on mixed martial arts for the WWE, and for WWE, they're trying to cash in on mixed martial arts. It makes sense why they would have it. However, didn't you point out that Brock Lesnar, he is subject to testing going into SummerSlam, so if he gets injured or if something happens, he may not be able to participate in that event, right?
Yeah, it's not the actual New York State Athletic Commission that does the testing. The WWE has to appoint a New York State doctor and has to clear Brock Lesnar. Now, a medical suspension from Nevada, that's an interesting case of how that would be acknowledged for a pro wrestling event in the state of New York. So many questions from this and going into the summer that we are going to have regarding Brock Lesnar's involvement with both WWE and UFC. But next week, our crew will be in Ottawa with wall-to-wall coverage of the UFC's return to Canada, which goes down on Saturday night, featuring your welterweight main event involving Rory McDonald and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson.